everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to our second event as part of the London Climate Change Action Week. My name is Katharina Winbeck, and I lead the policy team here at London Councils. London Councils is a membership organisation of all of the London boroughs and the City of London, and we work together on policy issues such as climate change to make a bigger collective impact and to support collaboration. Now, today we're talking about empowering local government to be climate leaders, and we could not have picked a better day. I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about the 10-point plan that government announced overnight. So a vast majority of local authorities have now declared climate emergencies and are developing very ambitious action plans. But we keep on hearing that we need more powers, we need more funding, and we need better conditions to enable us to really deliver on our joint ambitions that the local authorities are developing. So I'm really delighted to bring together a very exciting panel to discuss the empowerment of local authorities for the climate agenda further. And we have Patrick Allcorn joining us from the Government Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. And he will give us obviously the government perspective. Then we've got Mayor Phil Glanville, who's the chair of London Council's Transport and Environment Committee, and also the Mayor of Hackney, who will talk a little bit more about London's ambition in this area. And we then come to Sue Halliwell from ADEPT, the Association of Directors of Environment, Economy, Planning and Transport. And she's also the Director for Planning and Place at Oxfordshire County Council. And then we'll hear from Harriet Lamb, who's the Chief Executive of Ashden, a climate change charity, which has done some significant work in supporting local authorities on climate action. So really interesting panel. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon and giving up your time to do that. We also, of course, want to interact with you, our audience. And I know there's been a huge interest in this particular session. Last time I looked, it was over 170 people wanting to sign up. It might have gone beyond that now. And we've already had quite a number of questions submitted on Slido. So again, if you want to communicate with us on that, please go to the link should have a link on the left-hand side of your screen, which you can copy and paste. Or if that fails, please go to www.slido.com and use the code 52735. That's the code 52735. Now, we will look at those questions and come to them at the end after our speakers have given some of their insights and inputs. So so without much further ado, let me welcome Patrick Allcorn again, who is Head of Local Energy at BEI since 2015. And before joining Local Energy, he worked in the Heat Strategy team, where he developed a range of community energy initiatives and led the team that developed and launched the domestic renewable heat incentives. And prior to government, he's actually worked for Transport for London for a number of years, mainly on smarter travel. So Patrick, can I hand over to you and let us hear your government view and perhaps a few bits on the 10-point plan, if you can. That'd be great.
I'm not sure how much I can do on the 10-point plan, I'm afraid, Katharina. It was clearly launched this morning, and it's there for everybody to read, and you've seen almost as much as I have in the detail, but I will pick up on some of the issues in it. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that, to date, I don't think there has been a sort of standout moment where national government has said this is local government's role in climate. The Committee on Climate Change are presenting their views on the 6th carbon budget in December, and alongside that there will be a local report, the role of local actors report, and that's the first time that they too have really looked at the role of local authorities and others in this. So I think that while it is clear that everybody recognises that there is a key role, both in terms of the engagement with citizens around net zero, but also on the delivery of projects. So we just need to have a think about what those projects might be to understand how national government can't deliver this without local authorities. So the announcement around EVs and EV charging, the EV charging will be happening on the streets that you control as local authorities, as transport authorities. Heat will be done in buildings for your citizens. It won't be done backstage in the same way you can decarbonise the grid. You have to do that front and centre in place. So it's clear through the heat networks funding, some of the green homes funding, all of the EV funding, just how much we rely on local authorities to deliver that. And I think that's just going to increase over time. What you won't have seen to date and is kind of an explicit the statutory obligation of a local authority is to do X or Y. That doesn't exist to date. I think the local leadership element of that is really key. Local authorities own so much of the land locally. They run many of them still run their own housing facilities. There's a whole range of services and lands that the local authority, if you then take into consideration the wider public sector with the hospitals, with the courts, with the schools, everything else, that's a huge amount of the energy demand and the carbon emissions happening locally just from the public sector. So we do need to have a local leadership, and alongside that, I think really therefore integrating net zero into all of the services at local authority is probably the really interesting challenge. And you talked about the need for more powers, and I think it's really interesting challenge to see what those are, because we haven't necessarily leveraged the existing powers that we have to deal with the net zero challenges yet, because we've never had to do that. So some of the things in the waste management, some of the things around housing, some of the things around transport, if you did those differently, would you need this other power using those existing powers? And I think there's a really interesting challenge that national government and local government need to work through together around how things are done. We've provided Scatter, a tool both for reporting and also prediction of carbon action. That's been picked up by CDP, who are the International Covenant of Mayors reporting infrastructure. So it's there for any local authority. We've also just launched last month carbon literacy training for local authorities. So from your chief exec to your councillors, all the way down to the new staff and to your admin staff, there is support there to actually raise awareness and train people in your council to understand climate emergency and what it means to them and their jobs and what they can do in their jobs. And we've seen social landlords do that. We've seen the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, I believe, is now carbon literate. So I think there's a really important part in getting everybody on the same page in terms of knowledge before we move on to the actions. Then clearly, in terms of your own estate, the public sector decarbonisation funds there, it's £1 billion this year. There's work through Salix to deliver it. It's a package there for you to bring forward projects as councils, but also for your hospitals, for other central government buildings that might be in your areas to decarbonise those buildings. And that's all on a grant basis now. And then on the wider buildings, the Green Homes grant with the £2 billion, 1.5 of it in vouchers for your residents, but the other £500 million being distributed through the local area delivery programme. So we've already funded some 70 plus local authorities around the country to take actions on buildings, bringing those below band E up in terms of their efficiency. And there's a 1B is open now, and there's future rounds of that linked into the 10-point plan announcement today. So we're starting to see that move forward as well. And then, as I say, electric vehicles, and coming back to the fleet, understanding what of your own fleet can be converted to electric vehicles, and some of them won't be able to be and may well want to go towards hydrogen, but actually does the service provision change, a service provision change, enable you to use different types of vehicle? We're seeing a lot of talk about food waste collection at a local level. Do you need to collect those in the same size vehicles? That food waste, what are you going to do with it? Is that going into AD? Is that going to be producing electricity to power those vehicles? How do we create that real circular economy in that local authority, bringing these different strands of action together effectively? There's clearly some master planning work to do there around energy and around the wider issues. And we're starting to see a rollout of with Ofgem of local area energy planning, and we're building up a national methodology on that so that every local authority can do that planning with the energy companies. But we're looking at having that as a consistent methodology across the country, so that if a parish council wants to have a cut, if a regional authority wants to have a cut, if a national government wants to have a cut, all of it is interacting rather than every local authority doing something slightly different, which really helps them but doesn't allow for that interaction. The last thing I say is that there's a really important role for local authorities as well in terms of passing that empowerment on. So we talk about what we can do to empower local authorities, but what can local authorities do to empower their communities? And I think there's a really interesting role around neighbourhood planning. We did a study of the first 250 neighbourhood plans in England. Not one of them mentions energy. So we've done some work with CSE and other organisations to try and encourage and set out a framework for neighbourhood planning where you can start to have the conversations with them around energy and around the types of changes that need to happen and what that looks like for their communities as part of a bigger structural process with your local plan. So I think that's really important. But those communities are not just geographic communities. Those are business communities, sports communities. There are a wide range of communities of interest in your local areas that can reach people in ways that central government will never be able to reach in terms of messaging. And in some ways, local government is the only route to those communities that we need to engage. And between all of that, I guess what that comes back to is this point that the green plan, the 10-point plan this morning made, which is, we're investing this money, but out the back of that, that's 250,000 new green jobs. And it's that link back to that circular economy, that green economy, and how do we do this so that we are upskilling people and the skills strategies that local authorities have, the relationships you have with your colleges and things. What are the jobs that you're looking to bring through, and are those colleges providing the right courses to do that? So this isn't just about how do I retrofit house A on street B. This is about the whole of the area and how we bring that together in a really coherent and comprehensive way. My final point is that we have tried to a small degree to facilitate this through our local energy programme. So we now have 5 hubs in England with over 40 full-time employees providing capacity and capability to local authorities to bring forward the projects that they are looking to do. That programme has identified a £1.8 billion pipeline of projects in the short term, going up well over £5 billion in the long term of projects local authorities want to get away. And we're having conversations with investors, with organisations, and the capital is there to do it. It's just about having the capacity and the know-how, how to build the business cases and attract that investment. So I think there's some real upskilling that we need to do with local authorities in partnership to bring that development funding and to bring those skills to bear, because you've got the ideas, they've got the money, but that capacity to unlock that just doesn't exist yet. And that's what we're trying to do through the local energy programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Would you mind going on mute when you're not speaking? Thank you. That's much better. I was getting an echo. So thank you for that, Patrick. I mean, you mentioned the leadership role that local authorities have, particularly with engaging with their citizens and the other wider communities, business communities, the third sector, etc. And I think we all recognise that. But you're also given us a bit of a challenge. You know, do we always use the powers that we do have effectively enough? Do we perhaps need to think about some of the systems and processes we have got in place and how we might change them for the better, that we can do right now without needing further powers or resources? So some good challenge there as well. And I hear you about the training and getting everybody up to a certain standards, and London Councils actually has also got some training for senior officers and members, which has been really well attended and very well received indeed, which is great to see. But let me bring in Mayor Phil Glanville, now the London Council's Transport and Environment Committee Chair and the Mayor of the London Borough of Hackney since 2016. And previous to that, you were the councillor in Hoxton for 10 years, and you spent 3 years as a cabinet member for housing. And as Mayor, Phil, I know you've committed the council to doubling the number of council homes built from 2018, and for Hackney to become the first borough in London to build 500 living rent homes. So that's when no one pays more than a third of their income in rent, which is why you were talking a little bit particularly around retrofitting. So Phil, over to you, please.
Thank you, Katharina, and it's good to follow Patrick, I think, because it shows the sheer breadth of the challenges that we face. And I think local government is slightly caught between when it projects out saying we want national guidance, we want that national investment, and also what we can practically do already. And I think all tiers of local government sometimes get caught between that. I'm really pleased to be in this discussion, and I wear those multiple hats that Katharina said. I'm a relatively new chair of the Transport and Environment Committee here at London Councils. That's a statutory joint committee. It's got a lot of transport responsibilities, but it's also been tasked with its environment functions, but more recently coordinating our climate change response. And I think, as has been said, 28 boroughs in London have declared a climate emergency, 28 of 230 across the country. And I also have a role on the environment board at the LGA, where we're coordinating those activities. And I know Harriet from Ashden has presented to that board. And I think there's a real role for London Councils, the LGA, and the professional networks that Patrick referenced to bring together those skills, because no one part of local government can respond. You know, there's procurement, there's fleet, there's planning, there's within procurement energy, how we get our energy and how we support local energy generation. So I think what though is clear from those declarations of climate emergency is the level of local ambition. And I think what we've seen today is government starting to sort of catch up. But I think, as Patrick referenced, there's more work to do. And what's really important is we unpick the 10-point plan is just the role of local government and making sure that we're collaborators in that. You know, we're not going to build our own nuclear power stations, but we are going to be looking at what a decarbonised local energy grid looks like, and wanting to make sure that that is part of a broader solution for our energy needs. And while we obviously have the 2050 target nationally and under the Paris Agreement, I think it's 75% of London boroughs have gone for more ambitious targets of either net zero by 2030 or 2040, and half within that want to make sure that it's borough-wide ambitions, not just council emissions. So I think London really does have that ambition. And I think it hasn't, it hasn't abated any time during the COVID period. And we just released this week at London Councils the research that says, London's population, our residents, believe 70% believe 7 out of 10 Londoners that we should be acting on climate change. And that shows that degree of active citizenry interest. We had a really good debate yesterday. Just at the turn of last year, London councils and LEDNet issued a joint statement on climate change, and I think it was to take that ambition and say practically what do we want to do next. And I think it does align with what the government's announced today. Retrofit, really big and important, and Katharina references my previous life as a cabinet member for housing. There was a sort of challenge there, I think, of big projects, very tight turnaround times, often not leading to the best and most holistic solutions. I think what we need with retrofit is a long-term investment plan that allows that to align both with local planning policy, but also asset management strategies with councils as corporate and housing landlords, because all too often I saw us sort of being buffeted from kind of CESP and other funding streams and not necessarily delivering that long-term holistic approach that we'd want to see. I think planning is absolutely essential, whether it's the London plan or emerging plans around decarbonisation, biodiversity, and the sort of homes that we want to see. And I think both across planning and low carbon development, the social justice element of fuel poverty is absolutely essential. We have to have homes that are cheap for the end user, and not just homes that I think in their design can meet planning obligations around carbon and energy, but actually put them onto an end user and can exacerbate some of those fuel poverty challenges. I think the work on EV, London has been leading, nearly 6,000 EV charging points across the capital already delivered, a real partnership between the GLA, TfL, local boroughs, innovation within the private sector, and making sure that Londoners have access to what they need to make that just transition, whether it's a taxi driver, whether it's white van, whether it's local delivery, and there's more work to do. There's obviously within that more commitments around green resilient London and the green economy. Practical work though underpins all of that, and I think that's what's really exciting about what we're talking about, and that level of ambition across London's boroughs, making sure that our homes are up to EPC level B, back to retrofit, really important. And I think, you know, the levels of Londoners in fuel poverty are really stark, and we're seeing some of that playing out as more and more Londoners are at home. 11% of Londoners in fuel poverty. In Hackney, that's 12%. If we don't have an answer for those Londoners, the climate change debate can often look like a nice to do if you're sat in a cold home. We also know that the contrast around heat, an urban heat island, we've got to think about how we cool our homes and communities, and that's where the tree planting commitments and biodiversity are so important. London is also quite different, I think, to the rest of the country, and many of us are tenants. I'm a private tenant, many of us are social housing tenants as well. So some of those government schemes have to make sure that they are good for the homeowner that can make that long-term investment, but also helps landlords, whether corporate or private or state, to invest in their homes as well, because often there isn't the power and the purchase within our tenants to make those sorts of investments. And I think we're also seeing London councils, you know, even today, the announcement the City of London is looking for a green energy supplier and has signed that agreement for that Dorset solar farm, looking at how London can actually seed renewable energy generation, not just in the capital, but beyond, by investing in green energy ourselves. And I know Hackney has decarbonised our energy very quickly indeed, actually, when we focused on doing it. But I come back to those professional skills. It required procurement, it required energy purchasing to work together in new ways. We've announced we really think retrofit has to be at the heart of the spending review, and I don't take anything away from the announcement today, but to get to net zero by 2050, it's clear that we need to be investing 1 to 2% of GDP in that transition. What we're seeing today is probably only a fifth of that. If we're being generous, we do have to think about the spending review and that long-term certainty beyond the announcements. And I think also when we talk about national infrastructure, I do think we're still in a roads, a concrete-based infrastructure. We're still debating things like airport expansion. I don't take away from the challenges that communities that rely on airports are facing during COVID and what's happened since. But we do need to make sure active travel gets a proper voice and allocation. We're seeing that switch, but whether it's been enough so far, I leave to probably the further discussion. But lots to welcome. What is great is that I think there is innovation, there is energy. The link between local government and our active citizenry is incredibly important. And we have to make sure, and I think we're not just waiting for new powers and investment, we're seeing that innovation on the ground.
Thanks very much, Phil. And yes, I think that piece on, it's an all council agenda, really, as you mentioned, procurement, fleet, housing and so forth. And it's not just an environment dimension that we need to be looking at climate change through. That's a really important point. And of course, the polling of Londoners, as you mentioned, and the willingness of Londoners to make quite substantive changes when you think about it, but just they need to be a bit more enabled in doing so. So that's been really welcome. So thanks very much for that insight. And I'll now go over to Sue for another local authority perspective, but probably more national perspective, not a London one, because you are the chair of the ADEPT South East Board and also the director for planning and place at Oxfordshire County Council. So all about creating places where people want to live, work and play. And your focus over the last couple of years has been to secure investment into Oxfordshire's infrastructure through the Housing and Growth Deal and housing infrastructure funding. So Sue, over to you, please.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting ADEPT to talk to you today. I'm Sue Halliwell and representing ADEPT leadership team. And we have for a long time had climate change as a key priority, and it's within one of the top 3 priorities that we have within our strategic objectives for ADEPT. Because place directors and the place directors that we represent know the integral role that local authorities can play in tackling. It's not just a challenge, but it's an era, and it has to be, a lot of us have referred to a decade of action, and that's exactly what will have to happen. And it will be local authorities that can take forward, as we've already heard, a lot of that action. And so similarly, we welcome the announcements today. But I think what was missing for us as ADEPT was really understanding the role that local authorities can play in leading this change. I welcome the mentions just now around infrastructure and the need to change infrastructure, and that's going to be my focus for the next couple of minutes, because local authorities as highway authorities clearly can have a fundamental role in influencing what is delivered on the ground. But there does have to be some change in the system. And after all, I think climate change and responding to climate change is about system transformation. And there needs to be changes within the system so that we can really get some zero carbon infrastructure into our places. On the back of ADEPT having climate change and responding to climate change as one of our top priorities, we've worked with the partners that you've seen here, and obviously we've got Harriet presenting from Ashden, but we've been working together on this blueprint for accelerating climate action and green recovery at specifically a local level, representing our network across the country. One of the key priorities in that blueprint, and I should say, it appears my camera isn't working very well, so I also appear a bit blue as well, so apologies for that. But in the blueprint, one of the immediate priorities that we draw out is the need for investment into low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure. We're arguing in that and asking government within that document to secure more place-based budgets to really reflect the budgets that reflect the need of those local areas and communities. And I was asked the other day what scale a place should be at. And my response to that isn't necessarily about scale, it's about a whole system response. And to enable that to happen, we need to break down the siloed approach to funding some of these opportunities. So again, very much welcome the funding that we are having towards active travel and the recent announcements of the Tranche 2 funding, and that will go a long way to supporting some of the local ambitions to improve active and healthy travel. But again, it's a siloed approach to how you can really influence and really create that systematic change that you need to happen locally on the ground. I think we also argue within there around increased powers. We've already touched on that, and I'm sure there's a recognition that we haven't necessarily tested all of our powers yet, but there is more that we could do to devolve powers down to local authorities. In particular, we're still waiting, obviously, on the devolution and recovery paper, and we would very much like to see a strong focus on green recovery. We think there's perhaps been some missed opportunities within the planning reform paper, the Planning for the Future white paper that came out very recently. That maybe that has missed an opportunity to really drive zero carbon planning through growth. And so we're hoping that the devolution and recovery paper actually picks up some of that and gives a greater clarity to councils and combined authorities as to how powers will be devolved down to them so that they can take local action. And I think we need to focus on the fact that this is about connecting communities. Infrastructure in places is about connecting communities. It's about how we work. It's about how we are at leisure activities and how we spend our time just in those places, connecting with our loved ones, or as I say, with work or education. And local authorities can do a lot of that shaping, connecting through their local transport plans and indeed with regional transport plans that are emerging. But actually, through COVID, we've seen that this importance around connecting communities isn't just about building roads. And in fact, actually, the narrative is starting to change, and we can connect communities in different ways. And in particular, the digital agenda is rising up to be perhaps even more important than providing a new blacktop. Actually, how can we connect these communities in different ways? And I think I would also just reflect on the fact that whilst again, looking at banning any new petrol or diesel cars by 2030 and really moving to EV technology is also again very welcomed. But that doesn't really address the issue that you can be in the cleanest traffic jam possible, but you're still not going anywhere. So this is about, again, how do you manage demand within local communities so that you can connect. I would just wanted to finish off just by saying I'm conscious of time that ADEPT on its website, we do have the blueprint for accelerating climate action on there. There is an opportunity if you want to express your support for this blueprint and what it asks that are articulated in there for government. So if you go onto the website, then I'll encourage all of you to log on and sign up to show your support for the blueprint. I think that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. For sharing that and sort of highlighting particularly around the system transformation that is required to deal effectively with climate change, because all of the bits are so interlinked, and that we really do require a decade of action, not just a short-term action now, but we require a long-term set of ambitions that we are slowly ploughing away against and making real change on the ground. So without much more from me, now over to you, Harriet, from the climate charity Ashden, which you joined in 2019. Very experienced in winning public support for social and environmental solutions, as you previously led the peace building charity International Alert, and you spent 15 years growing fair trade in the UK and globally. So very welcome, Harriet, and looking forward to your insights.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to really pick up on what Sue said about the importance of connecting from communities to local authorities, from local authorities to then having the national policy frameworks that they need. So at Ashden, we run a respected awards programme where we seek to showcase inspiring examples and encourage them to both scale and, of course, be replicated. And in that, we particularly work with local authorities. And I would really hope you'd all look out for 2 awards we're launching in January next year. One which is exactly on this theme of citizen engagement, and another key theme we've been touching on today around green skills. And I think to answer a couple of the questions that came up before we started, one of them was about what networks are going on. And I thought that was a really important point to highlight the key ways that we can all better collaborate and share best practice. And so we at Ashden have been working with a network of sustainability officers throughout the country, coming together to share ideas, to steal with pride from each other in order to encourage change at the scale and pace that we need it. And then we've done deeper dives, building networks within 3 regions, including one here in London. And that work, to answer a separate question that was asked before this event, has indeed been funded by trusts and foundations who we would absolutely agree have a critical role to play in helping support that citizen engagement and indeed helping local authorities to pilot those new schemes. And in all our work, we've really sought to highlight the best practice among local authorities around framing both on fairness and inclusivity, to go back to that critical point that Phil mentioned about making sure that this is a just transition, as well as all the time highlighting what are the benefits to people who perhaps for whom climate change is perhaps not a priority, looking, for example, at how it can deliver people with warm, cosy homes or clean air, and those critical new jobs that Patrick was also talking about as part of being able to take the public with us on these difficult journeys and the difficult decisions that local government is often having to make. And if you haven't seen it already, I'd really recommend looking at the new research brought out just this week by Climate Outreach together with the European Climate Foundation. Really interesting research segmenting the public and their different attitudes towards action on climate change. But there's no question that moving to net zero is a huge governance task. And for local authorities to be able to drive that kind of change, they absolutely need the national policy framework. So not perhaps quite as beautifully illustrated as Sue here again is the front cover of that ADEPT report, in which actually we laid out 5 key areas. One was the low carbon infrastructure that Sue was talking about, but also talking about reskilling and retraining, about walking, cycling and enabling people to work at home, about putting in place the green infrastructure, and finally about homes and schools fit for the future. And these are areas where local authorities are already doing so much, but where they also need those national policy frameworks to help drive change. And I'm very glad that some of those issues were indeed picked up in the 10-point plan today, including the welcome announcement by the Prime Minister around a focus on homes, schools and hospitals being greener and energy bills being lower. And we made mention to the £1 billion for next year, but as has already been said, I think there's no question that the scale of changes we're going to need larger sums of investment and do need a very clear plan, including the resources and the powers to be given to local authorities so they can take action, while also we can engage the whole of society. And that's where I'd just like to spend a few minutes outlining a new campaign that we've just launched that seeks exactly to mobilise the whole of society behind these ambitions to reach zero carbon, but with a critical role for local and national government as well. So it's a new campaign launched just last week and launched in London this week for London Climate Action Week that seeks to see can all our schools reach zero carbon by 2030. And the campaign's being launched by a wide coalition, including people from the National Union of Students through to SALIX within government, as well as a range of sustainability organisations who have supported schools and will continue to support schools along those key pillars that they need to take action on to reach zero carbon. Really outlining how, for example, maybe schools have already taken action on Meat-Free Monday, and how can they build on that to tackle reduce the carbon footprint of the school meals throughout the whole week. And since the campaign was launched, as I say, just last week, I'm glad to say it's attracted strong support, including in particular from young people. And so far we've had the first 77 schools sign up. We've had 10 local authorities express interest in how they can help support their schools to lay out that roadmap to reach zero carbon by 2030. We've seen, for example, Hounslow here in London thinking about piloting zero carbon schools. We've seen places like Leicester take an approach of having, actually this moment they're running Sustainable Schools Fortnight, really working with schools throughout the area to see how we can get behind the sustainability agenda. Or somewhere like Bristol, where the local authority has put a joint bid in for the whole area to SALIX in order to enable those schools to retrofit. And so I really hope that local authorities will get behind this campaign, and also that national government will also respond to this call really from young people and see how they too can help support schools on those ambitious targets, giving again the national policy framework and mandate that will enable and empower people to take action within local authorities all the way down to each of our streets and neighbourhoods, including our schools.
Thank you very much for that, Harriet. And yes, the point about connecting, us all up together, local authorities, communities, businesses, schools, as you mentioned, schools in particular, of course, they are the next generation. And from our polling, we have seen that, particularly young people are very concerned about climate change and really do want us to be active on it and delivering on it. So I don't know if you can stop sharing your screen, Harriet, then I can see the panel again and everybody else. Lovely, that worked, thank you. So let's go over to some of the questions, because they have been coming in quite fast. And there was one question I wanted to ask. If we had unlimited funding, what would be the first thing that we would do to combat climate change? And Phil and Sue, can I come to you first for that?
Yes. So I think if you look at a lot of the makeup within local authority carbon emissions, if you look at area based, quite often the highest proportion is transport. So if we can get people to move around, it goes back to how you connect communities. If you can get to a point where you can completely decarbonise that, you're making a massive inroad into moving to zero carbon. The other thing, though, in the back of my mind, and I think it was mentioned earlier on, is about heating. That is such a difficult challenge, and retrofitting across the whole of the country. That is such a difficult challenge and a difficult nut to crack, that any kind of investment into that has to be top priority, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Susan has said. I think there's two things in unlimited resources. One, the things we can do within existing resources. So there's huge infrastructure funding, as I sort of referenced earlier, and I think Susan built on that point as well, and just went back to it, where we need a shift in what is being invested already. And you can do that at local level as well, with the right green infrastructure plan about what you're doing in terms of how you're managing that environment and how you're investing in transport infrastructure. And then I think it is those big issues like retrofit, which is way beyond the budgets that are available. And our housing revenue accounts, I'm going to trade on my previous expertise with housing. They're facing post-Grenfell challenges. They faced 4 years of rent reductions, real uncertainty about what's going to happen with their budgets, big ambitions about building new social and affordable homes, and yet they know they have to make this contribution to that warm homes agenda and retrofitting. And I think there's simply not enough within housing association and local government housing budgets to make that happen. So if I was to get the unlimited checkbook out, both for the impact on social justice, the long-term viability of our housing stock, and ultimately creating those local green jobs in our local communities that we've been talking about, I think that mission that London councils have set out around retrofitting is the absolute number one thing that we don't have any real mechanism for investing in from our existing resources.
Thank you, Phil. Can I also ask the question to both Patrick and Harriet, please, for your thoughts?
Okay. Thanks, Harriet, for the nod. I think for me, the challenge, whether it's unlimited or limited funding, is the same. It is around integrating these problems. And so for me, the first thing to do would be to get to enable local authorities to get the right data sets and the right information that they can make decisions around heat, transport and buildings simultaneously rather than separately, and to bring those players together, the transport authorities, the housing associations, the energy companies, so that you've got a really good understanding of where you are and where you're going to go. And I think that is fundamental, because at the moment, I think we are all doing, as Phil says, everybody is working flat out on problem A, problem B and problem C, that they don't actually understand how that aligns with the team across the hallway, the team on the floor below them, the other organizations. And I think there's so much duplication and there is so much stress that creating that shared sense of responsibility and that shared program is, for me, the fundamental crux of this.
Well, I completely agree with the points made already, but to add in, I think you would also have to put an absolute emphasis on training for green skills so that people can take up the jobs, because we've got to make sure this is a green recovery coming out of coronavirus, and we've got to tackle unemployment at the same time as the climate crisis. So I think a focus on green skills and enabling people to have careers in the new green jobs. I think it is really important to address also the slightly less sexy issues. I've got to mention things like procurement in local authority, where actually we could make big steps forward. It's not headline grabbing, it's not exciting, but it could make a difference. And it's something we know many local authorities would be very interested to be able to have more guidance on. I also really believe in the importance of action in areas such as was mentioned in social housing, but I would also then argue in schools, areas where we can have that wider ripple effect, where the public sector can take a lead, and by doing that, we will leverage in the private sector. That once people see that the public sector is coming behind retrofit and is putting its money there, and that the government, national and local, is backing that, then of course it becomes really worthwhile, the private sector also investing and training people in that. And by making action on things like schools and like social housing, I think we can help have that wider effect out into society and inspire and excite people.
Thank you for those insights. There's a number of questions on the planning functions in particular. And I think there's one I'd like to ask, again, Phil and Sue, probably first of all. How can council leaders and senior officers empower planning officers to negotiate with developers to push for energy efficiency without any fear of a peer? And I'm sure we would all know the answer to that. We would be, so thoughts on that, Phil? And
well, obviously, there's two questions in here. I think there's a bit of a confidence, training and capacity question. So one of the challenges is across local government, we've seen real challenges around funding, around expertise. So I think there's been a 40% cut in planning capacity and expertise. And the things that have been, I think, put most at risk can be those roles that are more specialised, whether it's around conservation, biodiversity, or energy. I think it's also the confidence to start using some of those powers around energy efficiency and carbon, and then thinking about where those funds can be used. But I think Patrick said earlier about local plans, so it's neighbourhood plans, and how many have actually addressed energy. I think we're all now making sure that the work that we've set out around climate emergency is going into our local plan work. I've seen that happen at Hackney. There are ambitious targets at the London plan, but you are constantly having to catch up with previous technology. I think that's one of the challenges. Most of the development that we've seen over the last probably decade and a half have assumed that gas-fired community-based energy systems are the most efficient. They will help schemes meet their carbon reduction and energy targets. And now we're saying, actually, no, that isn't going to get us to net zero by 2030, 40, 50, depending on the target that's been set. And now we're looking at other more community-based solutions. And I also come back to the point made around where the jobs and skills piece. We are going to need to make sure we're investing in the skills we're going to need tomorrow in that, not the skills that we might have within our existing organisations. And that goes for planning, but it also goes for the systems we're going to install and how they can be used by the end user. The challenge point, I think, is a bit more difficult, especially given the amount of policy development that's happening at the moment. We've got planning for the future white paper. We've got a London plan that hasn't yet obviously been fully adopted, local plans across London that are in various stages of adoption. And then I know also SPD work underneath that around where we go next on green infrastructure. I think there's a huge amount kind of happening, and it's the same group of people looking at these things. So I can appreciate where some of that sort of confusion and tension plays out in local authorities and also when assessing individual applications.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, the only thing I would just reiterate in that would be the absolute imperative to have the policy hooks and the right policy hooks that gives the officers the ability and the confidence to be able to negotiate for those sort of things. Where you see that has been in existence, you do get the results, but it has to be systematic, it has to be across the board. And so again, going back to planning for the future white paper, now there is one opportunity to really have a national framework that really pins our colours to moving to zero carbon. And I think it's really important to note that, again, going back to this retrofitting issue, that the policy frameworks that we're operating now are delivering the houses of the future. And our future has to be zero carbon. That can be no option. And it's the retrofitting that will bring the rest of the communities back to zero carbon.
Thanks for those insights. A question for you, Patrick. Are the recent energy efficiency grants going to become longer term schemes? One-off grants do not necessarily build the capacity that we need, and we talked about skills as well, or reduce the costs for the long term. Patrick, any insights on that?
Well, I think those are decisions for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and I don't pretend to be anywhere near that sort of pay grade. But clearly the announcement today put an extra £1 billion into buildings, which is an extension of some of those schemes. So we wait to see the details of that to come out. But that is where I think we're starting. Clearly, the manifesto that the Conservative Party had at the last election had even greater amount of money for retrofit over the course of the year, course of the Parliament. But we are in a position where we have only a single year spending review nationally, and so we only have another 1 year's money being announced this time. So I think it's very difficult for me to be projecting scale and length of those programs, but it clearly especially with the economic stresses of COVID and everything else, and what's happening there. But clearly it was the intention, both departmentally and from the government, from the Conservative Party at the election, to have a long-term programme. we just wait to see if we can actually make that happen with the current unforeseen circumstances of the pandemic. So we are doing what we can.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate that. Just a quick one, and probably one for you, Harriet. How can those of us with expertise best share know-how and business models for zero carbon? And you talked quite a lot about how we need to share more and share best practice.
Yes, I mean, I think that goes back to the theme in particular around what we can do in both in our local places, and that's obviously a key theme of where local authorities can take action, and then how we can share best practice right across the country. And I think there are lots of pockets of that sharing going on, and obviously it's something it's incredibly helpful if we can scale some of that up. But I think again that's when actually having the national guidance can also really help guide some of that. I would just also like to pick up on the last 2 points. I'd just like to say I think it's actually a real shame if we have to rely on skills training for our local authority planning officers. I actually would really hope that we could get stronger policy positions in place so that the building sector really does have to step up and it doesn't have to rely on negotiations. And likewise, I would really, although I'm disappointed that Patrick is not stepping up to a pay grade up or two above, absolutely support the importance of the longer term, because if you look at how different, I don't know if any of you have tried to get a Green Homes grant, it is almost impossible because there simply aren't the contractors there, because also people got burnt earlier by stop, start. And so the way the government has made many improvements, bringing in that sort of trust mark, the accreditation scheme, having that long-term surety that there will be support, therefore that there are jobs out there, is what will help catalyse the wider changes that we need, so that actually we get the skills, the jobs, and then the retrofit for the decades to come. And that's otherwise we're going to go stop, start, and we're never going to meet our targets.
Thank you, Harriet. And Patrick, you wanted to come in, I think, and if we could just have a quick 1 minute from each of the remaining speakers. Any last things you wanted to mention before I wrap up?
So just on that, the local energy programme runs a Teams group community for local authority officers. Anyone with a local authority address can sign up and get messages. There's a newsletter monthly from BEIS around the different things happening on local energy. And we're currently working with Energy Systems Catapult as part of Prospering from the Energy Revolution to create a community of communities. So it will be a signposting hub for all the other things. So the work that Susan and Harriet have talked about today will be linked in through that, so that it will be a one-stop shop for all local authorities across the whole programme. So for planning officers, for finance officers, for all the different people to come in and find the bits of information they need. It's going to take a while to build. These things are not easy to create, but it is our intention to have that up and running in a skeleton form by the end of this financial year, and then build it from there. So we are really keen to do that side of it. Just a final comment from me on the skills side of things. Please, to anybody writing a skills strategy, and I have been fortunate or unfortunate enough to read many of the LEP ones, don't forget CPD. There are hundreds of thousands of people out there now whose jobs will not be the same. So it's not just about what you can do for the 16 to 24-year-olds looking for their first jobs. It's about transitioning the 35-year-old, 40-year-old plumber, heat engineer, etc. as well. And that's going to be the real challenge, because they're in work, finding time to train, potentially losing income while they train. That's a real challenge that I think we've got to find a way to step up and bridge. Getting an 18-year-old to do a course in college is the easy part of that skills upgrade. I think the CPD, and it gets missed more often than not. So I think a real focus there.
Thanks, Patrick. And yes, of course, increasing challenge due to COVID as well, as you mentioned. Okay, I'm very aware we're running out of time. It's been such a great discussion. But any one last minute additions, Phil and Sue? I just did want to give you that opportunity.
Just very quickly, I think there's a huge amount of policy development happening at the moment. I know we're all making representations into the various bills and white papers. There's a lot to fight for, I think, in terms of resources, repurposing, whether it be biodiversity credits, whether it's about the producer pays, and then where those resources get reinvested. In terms, I've seen some of the questions on Slido around circular economy. The more we can get what resources out there into local communities and local solutions and building that as local authorities and partnerships of local authorities, I think the better. We'll ultimately end up with more innovation and I think more impact on the ground. And I come back to what Londoners want to be part of this solution on climate change. They want to see that leadership at a ground level. And then we're also not just waiting for big budget announcements. We can start using those frameworks and regulations in a way that hopefully the drafters originally wanted us to. If though we go in the other direction and all of that is centralised and stays in national systems, I don't think we will unlock the innovation that we need to see to go forward. Thanks,
Phil. Sue?
Only to say, completely agree, long-term funding to provide that certainty, ensure that we have the right level of devolution that we need to empower local authorities, and have a look at the blueprint and sign up to it to show your support.
Thanks very much. And now it just comes to me really to thank the panel. So Harriet, Sue, Phil and Patrick, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to everybody listening and watching and for all your questions and participation there. I'm sorry we didn't get through more of them. Really fruitful discussion, quite a bit of food for thought, and somebody also mentioned in the question, have we actually done a look at all of the powers that we have available to us and map them sort of across what further we need? And I think that is probably a piece of work we need to think about a bit more carefully. So thanks very much. So London Councils, we will continue to work with our partner organisations on this important issue, and this session will be available on our website with the slides along to it. So thanks very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.